I'm Rudy Cullen in the CapeCod.com News Center, joined today by a special guest from the Hollywood sphere of Cape Cod. Do you mind just introducing yourself for our listeners?
Or reintroducing myself. I'm Casey Sherman, and I'm back here to share some more stories with you, Grady.
So Helltown specifically, when you're picturing, I want to talk about the culture of like movies in general and stuff. Immediately, I was taken back to like Zodiac with Jake Gyllenhaal. Great, I'm a big fan of that. So I mean that with only layers of compliments. But is that something the kind of vibe you're going for, like that more? Like,
oh, absolutely. That ambiguous crime story that doesn't have that gavel pounding necessary ending. Mm-hmm. Yes, we do know Tony Costa was the killer of these women, and he is found guilty, during a trial which happened here in Barnstable, one of the most sensational murder trials to me in American history. But the Zodiac is such a great comp. David Fincher. It's dark, it's moody, and I think that the filmmakers that I'm talking to, that I'm working with, have an understanding of that type of vibe and feeling they want to get across. And the killer himself, he was incredibly charismatic, much like Charles Manson. And I learned after I'd already written the book that Charles Manson and Tony Costa actually knew each other, that they were living in the same neighborhood in San Francisco in 1967, going to the same parties. I'm sure they weren't swapping stories about how their, killer instincts were evolving at the time, but the fact that they were breathing the same air, and on one side of the United States, you have a charismatic hippie messiah killing, famous people in Hollywood. And here on the other side of the United States, you had his doppelganger in Tony Costa, who was incredibly charismatic, who had a lot of young hippies circling him here in Massachusetts. And that allowed his victims to, let their guard down with him. And ultimately, that ended up incredibly tragically for them and their families.
Mm-hmm. Now, while I had you in as well, I wanted to talk a little bit more like grand scheme filmmaking stuff. I've been noticing a bit of an exodus from Hollywood as of late. Of course, Vancouver has always been a haven for filmmaking, but also like Atlanta. And I want to ask you, as a local filmmaker, essentially, what have you been thinking about that? Do you think that the strikes may have kind of split people up a bit more? We've been seeing more filming far afield. Do you think Massachusetts might have some future in the filmmaking industry in general?
I think Massachusetts is probably one of the most aggressive and productive film communities in the entire country. You've got a groundswell of very talented people working on films where, 20 years ago, if you had a major film shot in Massachusetts, the studios would send all of their experts here to Massachusetts to film, whether it's the assistant director, the grip, you name it, the entire crew would be brought to Massachusetts to film. Well, that entire crew now lives here in Massachusetts, and they go from one production to the other. As I said, they're incredibly professional. There's a new Netflix series based on Ellen Hillenbrand's book, The Perfect Couple, which was shot here in Chatham. And I can bet that most of the people that worked on that limited series also worked on my films, The Finest Hours and Patriots Day. It's a small community, but very robust film community here in Massachusetts. And to your earlier point, a lot of people are moving away from LA because of taxes, because of just the topography and the climate. They want to, venture out and work where they live. And New England has been, so convenient for a lot of these very talented professionals to plant their, flag and then work locally and then be able to go back home to dinner, with their wife and kids every night.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that is certainly an appeal. We have New York as well, with obviously there's like a big Broadway. There's a lot of history of live theater up the Eastern Seaboard in general. Do you think that that's an untapped potential? You think? I'm noticing you're putting your hooks into the live theater space. Is it so you can pull in talent?
It's so you can pull in talent. Exactly. There's nothing that exposes an actor more than being on a stage in front of an audience, or heightens their talent. And I've been able to work with incredibly talented people over the course of my theatrical productions. Some of the actors that I've employed in the past, may not have been able to transition from film to the stage effectively, but then there are others that really, are incredible at that. And those are the people that I always reach out to first for my stage productions. And this production's interesting because everybody is donating their time for A Nightmare with Casey Sherman, March 26th at the Wilbur Theater, because it's also a fundraising event for the Peter Frates Foundation for ALS. I wrote the book on Pete Frates along with my writing partner, Dave Wedge, in 2017. And the mission of ALS families has always been very close to us. So all the proceeds for this particular production are going right to helping people with ALS and helping their families.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's great to hear. It's also it's wonderful to be able to kind of have that nonprofit focus.
Exactly.
So in general, I also wanted to ask you have an upcoming new book that you've been doing. This is Blood in the Water.
Yep.
That is a tremendously local story, and this is all we're talking about off camera. And this is also the first time that you've been covering something that's been so this is still ongoing. So dare I say, this conversation might have to be quite tempered with.
Sure. Well, the book is done. And I can only tease what we're going to be, the readers are going to be reading in April of next year when the book comes out. But it's actually the second time that I've been working on a story that is enveloping in real time. I wrote, obviously, Patriots Day. So,
Yes.
I was working on that while, along with my partner in that project, Dave Wedge, while, Boylston Street was still smoldering and while, they were actually still looking for the bombers in Watertown. This story is about Nathan Carman. Nathan Carman was a young man on the autism spectrum who in 2016 took his mother out on a deep sea fishing trip off the coast of Rhode Island, and something happened on the boat. The boat sank. The mother disappeared and most likely drowned. And Nathan was a castaway on a life raft for up to 7 days, according to Nathan, before he was rescued by a passing Chinese cargo ship. And when the story broke nationally, it was a bittersweet story because, this young man was saved. Isn't that great? But his mother is likely dead. But when they get Nathan back to the Coast Guard station in Boston, they begin to pick at his story. And they realize that, his life raft shouldn't have been drifting in the direction that it was had he, had the boat gone down where he said it was. So that's kind of the first thing that they looked at. Then they realize that he's also the prime suspect in the shotgun murder of his elderly grandfather 3 years prior, allegedly all to seize control of a $50 million family fortune. Ultimately, Nathan is charged with his mother's murder. He's never charged with his grandfather's murder. And he's about to go to trial last year when he's found dead in his jail cell in New Hampshire. So the trial doesn't happen. I had to really gumshoe this case and interview well over 30 witnesses. And like anybody that has read or watched television episodes about this case, I thought this kid was guilty. Now I can't say that as strongly as I believed it going into this project because other likely suspects in this case emerge throughout my reinvestigation of this case. I think it's probably the best investigative work that I've ever done, and I can't wait for readers to, buy the book April 8th, 2025. It's also available for pre-order right now on Amazon, Blood in the Water.
Yeah, because we'll also have you back in as well when it gets a bit closer to the actual launch date too. And did you interview like Coast Guard and stuff like that? Were you able to find people like who were there during the rescue?
I've interviewed the Coast Guard. I've interviewed the FBI. I've interviewed a lot of people that knew the family, and a lot of their perspectives are different. I ultimately let the reader decide whether or not this young man was guilty of these two crimes. Some days I wake up and I think he is. I think, the other days I'll wake up and think there's no way he could have pulled it off. And I detail that in the book. And as I said, I think the readers are going to read something much differently than has been out for public consumption since this case exploded nationally in 2016.
All right. Well, we will stay tuned, and also like always great to see wonderful journalism. Both sides, never really fully saying one thing or the other. But it's interesting to see, and I look forward to checking it out myself as well when it gets to that April date.
Appreciate it.
So what is next for you? If this book is just wrapped up, what's the next project? I know you always have something on the back burner. So
yeah, the next project, I just signed a publishing deal for a book that I'm titling "The Devil and Frank Lloyd Wright," about the most famous architect in American history, if not world history. Frank Lloyd Wright was involved with a mass murder in 1914 that shaped his entire outlook when it came to architecture. So it's an incredible story that really nobody knows about. I'm now in the kind of the hunting and gathering phase of my story. I usually collect all the information ahead of time, and then I can piece together what the narrative is going to look like. That book will be coming out in 2026, but I'm incredibly excited about that.
All right, awesome. What is it? Is it like the cork board with like the red strings going
No,
across,
it's not a murder board. It's actually all in my head, quite
Really?
frankly. Yes. I see the murder boards on every TV show, and I always get a kick out of that.
Thus the nightmares. Is what I'm beginning to gather,
No,
Casey.
it's all in my head. I've been doing this for so long, Grady. When I sit down at my keyboard, I can just play. I can just see how this story is going to unfold. Yes, I've got stacks of documentation and letters and personal artifacts that I need to touch, look, and feel before I get to the writing stage. But when I sit down, I kind of know where I'm going. I have a loose idea, I should say, of where I'm going. But the discovery for me and the greatest challenge and the greatest reward is, how am I going to get there? I don't outline my books ahead of time because I feel like it's the journey that I really get excited about.
Really interesting. That's I've heard, I don't remember who told me this, but the idea of like, okay, when you sit down and you're moving your fingers at the keyboard, that's typing. But what's happening, I'm pointing at my head for those who aren't watching the video, that's the writing.
That's the writing. And I'm writing when I'm not typing. I write 24/7. I'm always, involved in a story that I'm working on or looking ahead at. Yes, I'm still in the present, but I do, I do spend a lot of time thinking about these stories that just, speak to me.
All right. Well, just for the creatives out there and those who are interested in the arts themselves, do you mind just telling us what your setup looks like? Are you cranking out the old typewriter, or are you more of a computer guy? What's your home studio look like?
Yeah, I wrote my first 2 books on a computer, on a typewriter rather, using the whiteout, and that became such a process that I do have a laptop. I surround myself with great music. I surround myself with, obviously, the documentation I need to be able to have at my ready anytime I'm looking to kind of write the next chapter or the next part of that story. I surround myself with literature when I'm writing. I like to read. That is really, that's flexing and exercising my mental muscles. I'll go to bed with 2 books every night and read, probably 10 pages from each book just to keep the muscles working. And I always learn from other writers that, go take me on their journey. I said, oh, geez, that's really interesting. They were able to articulate this period of time in a certain way. I won't copy that, but it certainly will influence how I might approach a certainly challenging part of the story that I'm working on.
Well, at risk of starting the next Cape Cod Broadcasting Book Club, can I ask, what is Casey Sherman reading as of late? Do you have some favorite books that's been on your nightstand? Or
sure.
Some stuff, or?
I just finished a book called There Will Be Blood, and I think it's an excellent, excellent story about the assassination attempt against Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, perpetrated by the IRA. And it focuses on both sides, the militant IRA side of that story, and also the bombing detectives at Scotland Yard that were really trying to hunt these people down before they could do even more damage. It's written by an Irish writer, but it's a very balanced story, and it's fantastic.
All right, awesome. We'll have to check that out at some point. Casey, I'm afraid that's about coming up on time at this point, but is there anything else you wanted to highlight for our listeners while I still have you about ongoing projects, stuff you're excited about, anything you wanted to hit for our
Sure. I'm also, working diligently to bring the Pete Frates story to the big screen. It's the 10th year anniversary of the Ice Bucket Challenge, which created a social media phenomenon across the world. Now, think about this, Grady. Before the Ice Bucket Challenge, there was no GoFundMe. There weren't buttons on social media apps that lent themselves to fundraising. Pete Frates created that environment, which is now culminated in billions of dollars generated for charities around the world. And at the heart of his story is a love story between he and his wife, Julie Frades, that I'm really capturing. Myself, Dave Wedge, and our screenwriting partner, Jake Crane. We're working on the script based on Pete's life. It's also a love story about baseball because Pete was a baseball player, and about Fenway Park. I actually had an event at Fenway Park back in August to recognize the 10th anniversary of the Ice Bucket Challenge with Pete Frades' family, with Governor Healy, with members of the Red Sox and other celebrities that, and members of the medical community that could talk about the advancements that have been made over 10 years. So that, I would say, is my passion project to get that film made. And every day I wake up trying to advance that project for sure.
All right, awesome. A very sweet story as well. 10 years, actually. Wow, time flies.
Yes,
It
exactly.
feels like yesterday I was doing that in school, essentially.
Right.
But now it's, 10 years. Well, it's great to hear there's been a lot of progress, though. And yeah, good luck getting that to the stage and to the getting it onto the silver screen, potentially.
I'm excited about it.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Casey, for joining me for this conversation. It has been a pleasure, as always.
Always a pleasure for me, Grady. Thank you so much.
I'm Grady Collane, and thank you for listening. I'm Grady Collane in the CapeCod.com News Center.